All right, folks, you guys hear me in the back okay? Great. Okay, I thought this would be a good one to start with. My mind is made up, don't confuse me with the facts. I'm gonna throw a lot of data at you today. A lot more than the last lectures. And I'm gonna implore you to keep your mind very open. All I'm gonna share is data. I'm gonna share my opinion on that data as well. But this is a very emotional topic for many people, for many of us. So be patient and charitable with me. All right, welcome to the series. Who was here last time? Raise your hand. Fantastic. Who has never been to any of these lectures before? Raise your hand. Okay, so it's mostly our group. And you new guys are okay too, I guess. All right. Okay, so you know President McConkey, you know me, and we are now going to talk about the great Wedge issue, LGBTQ plus theology, policy, and sociology related to sexual minorities in the church. So, yeah, we're going to try to harmonize LGBTQ fundamentals with the gospel of Jesus Christ based on the data that we have. So, this is kind of the dichotomy that I think is really familiar with a lot of people, especially sexual minorities. But this really applies to all of us. On the mercy side, we might think God created me this way and loves me exactly the way I am. On the justice side, we might think I'm broken, and until I'm fixed, I will never be worthy. Now, neither of these statements are good and true. Neither of these statements are justice or mercy. So I think that's maybe a first step in understanding, well, frankly, the gospel of Jesus Christ. And it can certainly be well applied to the topic of sexual minorities in the church. I thought I'd start with this concept of justice and mercy and help calibrate us. This is a more humorous way to do it. I think this is kind of funny. This is from a TV show. Our religion is based on love, Sheldon, not fear. Well, so what happens when people don't follow the rules? They burn in hell. So, I don't know if that would play as well at Protestant churches, but all right. So what is a sexual minority? About 4% of Latter-day Saints in the U.S. Identify as sexual minorities. So this is interesting within the context of Latter-day Saints. This is significantly lower than the non-Latter-day Saint population in the U.S. This is recent data from the 2023 B.H. Roberts National Survey. So it's fresh data. It's a snapshot taken from 2023. About 4%. So what is LGBTQ plus mean? Well, L is lesbian, G is gay, bisexual, transgender, queer or questioning, and plus is everything else. So there are lots of different acronyms, but this is probably one of the most common ones to use. Speaking of terminology, I'm just going to go through some quick terminology here. Again, depending on what generation you are or who your friends and family are, this may be new to you. Other people might be like, yeah, I already know all this, but I think it's important. So instead of saying homosexual or queer, try saying gay, lesbian, or queer. Notice queer is twice. Queer historically was a pejorative. Now it's perfectly okay to say if you put it in the correct context. So queer is a fine term to use, and it can mean it can be gay or lesbian or transgender. It's just sort of an umbrella term. Homosexual, you think, well, what's wrong with that? Used in a clinical context, it's acceptable. But just in everyday talk, it's really not something that's acceptable. It's a little hurtful. There's a lot of nuances to this. Semantics are inherently complex, and they change. If I was giving this 10 years from now or 30 years ago, this would be a different list. But this is where we are today, okay? Transsexual, not a good term to use. Transgender is the proper term now. Transvestite, we now say cross-dresser. Hermaphrodite, intersex is the appropriate term. Biological male or female, we now say assigned female or male at birth. I just want to point out, I do my best, but it's tough, right? I'm 50 years old, and growing up, these were different. So you'll see me slip. And then a lot of times we'll be talking about academic or clinical work, and I'll shift into a more clinical way of speaking, which sometimes matches this and sometimes doesn't, based on the context. A lifestyle, an identity, right? Sexual preference, instead sexual orientation. Preference implies choice, orientation doesn't. So we'll talk a lot more about that as well. But again, just wanted to level set on how to speak in 2024 about this topic. Also, I want to talk about sex and gender. Again, we're still talking about terms. Get the vocab right? Gender is how you present yourself, okay? Sex is biological in nature. And sex and gender traditionally are congruent. They were the same things traditionally, now they're not. Not necessarily, anyway. They can be different things. A really simple, overly simple, in fact, it's so overly simple I might not want to say it, but I will anyway because I think it's universally understood. Like a tomboy, or you know, that's maybe a girl that is biologically a girl, but dresses and acts like a boy. So that you have a gender representation and maybe a biology representation. So again, oversimplified, but you can see that's a very simple example of a difference between sex and gender. Okay? All right, let's just a quick note on intersex. Clinically, they're referred to disorders of sexual development or sex development. The definition and the prevalence of intersex is actually hotly debated. It's a point of controversy, even amongst academics and scientists, social scientists. I think a reasonable definition that is widely accepted is that it's defined as chromosomal sex inconsistent with your phenotypic sex. Basically, your chromosomes don't quite match up how you look. Again, oversimplified. The majority of intersex people have physical characteristics that do match with dominant male or female appearance. There's about 0.02% to 0.05% intersex people, generally speaking. So that's about 1 in 2,000 or 1 in 5,000. So there might be one intersex person in our state. And chances are you wouldn't know. If you saw them, you probably couldn't tell. But I mean, something's not quite right with their chromosomes. And so how that manifests and what type of intersex challenge they have, unless they talk to you about it, you may not know. Okay? So these are intersex people. This is a great quote to refer to this, I think apply to this. Kindness, compassion, and love are powerful instruments in strengthening us to carry heavy burdens imposed without any fault of our own and to do what we know to be right. President Oaks. So, all right, so this is a little bit about intersex. By the way, this, like I said, is very controversial. There's a common thing you hear, oh, there's as many intersex people as there are people with red hair. That's not true at all. But if you widen the definition to include people that identify as non-binary, that don't actually have biological or chromosomal issues, you can begin to widen that field. But again, we're talking about biology here. Gay and straight, okay? These are not binary things. You're not, I'm straight or I'm gay, right? It's actually on a spectrum. The spectrum is traditionally called the Kinsey scale. It's developed by Alfred Kinsey, who by all reports was a total creep, but his scale is pretty useful, and so we still use it today. And this, the majority of people are clustered on the heterosexual side, which is 0, so completely heterosexual. If you're like, hey, I'm a dude, but I kind of like Tom Selleck when he wears shorts, maybe that means you're a 1 or a 2 on the scale. For example, right? That's none of my business. It's just you do your thing. But that's to understand how the Kinsey scale works, all right? And you can see, and this data comes out all the time. This is just one that was done from a YouGov survey, and you can kind of see, by the way, this is done by ages. You see 18 to 29 are significantly higher in a lot of the middle part. Younger people tend to identify, and we'll talk more about that in the middle of the scale. So, all right, love. Let's talk about love for just a minute. Traditional definitions of love: philia is friendship or love for family. Agape is like a divine love, and eros is like a passionate or romantic love. Okay, and a lot of what we're going to be talking about is here. When I talk about eros, I'm not talking just about sex. Okay, someone who's gay is not just like, I'm gay because I only care about sex with men, if they're a guy. It's more than that. It includes romantic relationships and passion and a million other things on a spectrum of relationship. Sex is an integral, central part of that. But all of us, when we love each other in a romantic way, it's not just about sex. When we're 18 years old, it might be. But anyway, so just a little bit about love, okay? All right, let's start with queer history. We start at the beginning, start way back. Unfortunately, the problem with queer history is there's almost none of it, at least that we know. In the 20th century and in the 21st century, there's been a trend to queer history, okay? And that means taking what we know about history and reinterpreting it through a queer lens and trying to see if we can discern queer lifestyles or writings or philosophy in ancient texts and practices and artifacts. That's really, really hard, okay? Lots of cultures, have bits and pieces of stuff that it's like looking at tea leaves, and people have written a lot about it. The problem is we just don't have a lot of historical data on this. Where we do have some data is with the Greeks and the Romans. They wrote stuff down, but even they didn't write that much down about this. I can tell you there's no Greek or Latin word for homosexual. Homosexual, that didn't exist in ancient times. We don't have any evidence that someone said, I'm gay and you're straight. That just wasn't something anyone ever said, okay? Gay sex was socially acceptable and was typically between adult men and young teenage boys. Pedestry is what this is, and that is, culturally, it was acceptable. Two adult men having sex with each other was a little strange. That was not the norm. Gay sex between adult men existed, like I said, because of social implications. If you were a top, you were dominant. If you were a bottom, something was wrong with you, okay? In Rome, in fact, you were put to death if you were a soldier and you had gay sex. Unless, again, you were having it with a prisoner and you were on top. Then it was okay. Again, it was a very different way of thinking, all right? Lesbian relationships, we just don't know. There's just, how things were back then. Didn't write a lot about women. There's a few little bits and pieces and a lot of queer writing related to lesbianism in the ancient world. There's lots of text on that. Very few actual primary documents that speak to sexual relationships. Okay? So that's kind of all we know. We can look to the Bible, right? In biblical times, Judeo-Christian tradition, these things on the left were really unacceptable. Okay? The things on the right were okay, right? And if you were here for the polygamy lecture, you see polygyny there and heterosexuality. Now, what happened, though, in modern times, we got rid of polygyny. That's not okay. All these other things became okay. Now, pederasty and bestiality and incest are still not okay. But everything else is okay. So sexual morality changes. Historically, this change is pretty radical. But this is just to orient yourself around that, how sexual morality has changed. What's that? Oh, pederasty. That's when an adult male has a sexual relationship with an adolescent boy. Okay? Bestiality is when you have sex with an animal. When a man has a sex with like a sheep or a goat or a horse, you know. And then incest is when you have sex with a son or a daughter has sex with a mother or father or a sibling. Sorry, I didn't define that. Okay. So for the past 6,000 years, sex is something you did. Okay? Now it's something you are. Really huge difference. Has amazing social implications. For example, if you stole something, that's an action, well, then you're a thief. If you lie, you're a liar. If you had a cigarette, you're a smoker. Okay? Of course, being gay, you know, having gay sex just doesn't mean you're gay because it's more complicated than that. But again, I just want you to appreciate for 6,000 years how it was and how it is now. I'm going to share with you something from a model from Ty Mansfield. He's a faculty member at BYU, and he's a social scientist and a therapist. It's called The Tiers of Sexuality. And I think it's a great model for understanding same-sex relationships. Or frankly, any kind of sexual relationship, really. So attraction and aversion, these are experiences. You say, gosh, I'm attracted to this person or this thing, and that just happens, right? That's a foundational thing that happens. Orientation is something where you're like, you know what? This keeps happening. I'm going to invest in this. I'm going to embrace it, and we're going to just, this is becoming how I act. And these things are complex developmental and environmental issues. And we'll talk a lot more about that, but they're usually unconscious. They just sort of happen. All right? Next, we have behavior. Who you choose to have a relationship with. And then finally, an identity. What you decide to call yourself. These things are conscious decisions. So we have less conscious and more conscious decisions. And you can put a spectrum here on little, like low or no agency here on the bottom, and high agency at the top. So when you think about sexuality, you can decide, okay, how is my sexuality built here? What part am I thinking about consciously and making decisions about versus what part I've just sort of showed up, you know? Or maybe you can trace it back to your youth and say, well, I can kind of see how this formed this way, right? This is, I think, a useful model, a constructive model. It's a little more complicated, but I think if you want to understand sexuality, this is a useful way to do that in a productive way. So let's get back to queer history, right? We're going to go to Germany, right? In the 19th century, this is where the concept of homosexuality and, frankly, heterosexuality showed up. German psychiatrists and gay activists, there were laws, anti-sodomy laws in Germany, and some people in the late 19th century said, you know what, I don't like this. And they basically said, look, and that's what they called gay people back then, Urnings. We deserve love and recognition, and in fact, we should be married. Way back then, they were talking about gay marriage. Now, a few decades before, this was nonsense, because no one knew what a gay person was. There was, again, essentially no such thing as a gay person. It was just, hey, that dude has sex with dudes, and he just does that. But you didn't say that guy's gay. Okay. We're going to go through some history really quick here. 1950s, and there's so much I'm leaving out. I say this every lecture. I've spent, probably about 1,000 hours studying sexual minority history in the 20th century. So it just killed me not to include the fascinating history of the 20th century. But this is something that at the B.H. Roberts Foundation, I personally have spent many, many hundreds of hours over the last 4 years studying. The Mattachine Society started in 1951. This was known as the first gay rights group in America. The American Psychiatric Association published the DSM-1, which basically said, look, we're going to pathologize being gay. If you're gay, that's a type of mental illness, and we need to treat this. The British Medical Association called for research in 1955. They said, we need to learn about gay people. Let's start studying this. So they put a general call out for people to start researching this. And the Wolfenden Report, they got tired of prostitutes and gay people in their prisons, because if you had gay sex, you got thrown in prison. And the British government's like, we're tired of all these guys in prison. We need to fix this, and so go figure it out. The Wolfenden Report basically said, maybe we should stop throwing them in prison. Maybe we should help them become not gay. So that was the beginning in Britain. In the US, there's not much history. I mean, the Mattachine Society, that's French. I think it means stranger or other or hidden person. Does anyone know French? Mattachine? Come on, really? All right. Okay, 1960s. The UK, they started having hospitals start to do gay conversion therapy and psychoanalytical work with gay people, trying to help them figure out how to be happy with their life, and predominantly to have them become heterosexual. So all that work started in the 60s. It was all unwanted homosexuality, generally speaking. At the time, there were very few people that were like, I'm gay and I'm stoked on that. Everyone was like, I'm married to a woman and I have 5 kids and I keep sneaking out at night and having sex in the park and I want to stop. Like, that was the typical person that worked with these health facilities. I've read many transcripts of interviews and clinical work, and that is the typical case. Stonewall riots happened in New York in 1969. So basically the 60s was a bunch of research in Britain, and then some queer people in New York that were at a gay bar were getting arrested by police, and they said, you know what, we're tired of being arrested. Screw you guys. And they threw bricks and stones and bottles, and they rioted for 2 or 3 days. And that became really the mark. It was a big social change in our country, because instead of hiding in the shadows, queer people were like, leave us alone. We are doing what we're doing. We're in America. And in America, you can do what you want. And so that was the beginning of that, the Stonewall riots. 1970s, the first gay pride parade happened. Right after 69, you get 70, and we have a parade. The Gay Liberation Front started to what they called ZAP, the American Psychiatric Association. They would have conferences every year, and this was a strategy, pretty smart. They said, you know what, our biggest problem is people think we're mentally ill. So we need to literally attack and invade the APA and demand that they cure us by changing the manual. So they started to go to these conferences and scream and yell and protest and disrupt them. And after several years, this is kind of a strange photo here. See this guy with the scary mask? That's a psychiatrist who put a mask on, and he actually took over the stage. This is in '72, if I remember correctly, and basically said, hi, I'm gay, and I'm a psychiatrist, and I'm not crazy. We need to change this. So after a few years, they did. Various American universities were experimenting with conversion therapy at this time. We'll talk a little bit more about that. BYU did as well. They came in sort of last. Harvard was kind of in the forefront of this. And then the APA depathologized homosexuality in '74. Okay? Following that, the American Psychological Association did, and then a few years later, the American Medical Association, and it just sort of the dominoes happened. Okay? Now we're in the 80s. The AIDS crisis. Gay Olympics started. ACT UP. I grew up out in the San Francisco Bay Area, so the 80s, this is kind of when I grew up. This is all very familiar to me. This was all around me at the time. They were the silence equals death folks, a lot of protests. The APA continued. And by the way, after the '74-'75 ruling, pretty much all research into conversion therapy stopped. No one could get funding for it. They started policing papers to make sure nothing was negative about homosexuality. And so the research just drops off the planet. New research started to replace it to emphasize how healthy homosexuality was and how important it was to be part of our society in an equitable way. In '87, they said, you know what? Even if you're gay and you don't want to be gay, we don't care. You have to be gay. You have to affirm. And if you don't, something's wrong with you. So this was kind of a big change, right? They went kind of in the middle, and then they went over, right? And this is how it is today. It's called ego-dystonic homosexuality. That was the fancy name for unwanted homosexuality, but they kind of threw that out. So there's no such thing as that. And there was a publication of The Overhauling of Straight America in 1987. This is an important work from a couple of guys from Harvard, a neuroscientist and a marketing guy from Harvard, that said, you know what? We have to put a plan together to make America accept gay people. So they put a plan together. We'll talk a little bit more about it later. It was a brilliant plan, and it worked quite well. So that's the 80s. Again, a really a summary, a very poor summary. The Defense of Marriage Act happened in 1996 because legislation was starting to look around themselves and say, something's changing here in our society. Let's protect marriage. Let's allow states to say, we're not okay with gay marriage. Will and Grace, The Ellen Show, we laughed, we cried, we sympathized. It started becoming part of our culture. And then Matthew Shepard was murdered, and we got angry. Bill Clinton recognized June as the Gay and Lesbian Pride Month in '99. So then in the 2000s, Robert Spitzer, he was actually the one that was responsible for depathologizing homosexuality in the 70s. And nearly 30 years later, he said, you know what, I'm going to do a little more research here. He published an enormous amount of data that said, you know, it turns out a lot of people that were gay became straight. And I'm fascinated by this, and so I documented all of this. And it turns out, perhaps, some sexuality is fluid. It can change. And it nearly destroyed his career when he published this. And in fact, 10 years later, right before he died, he was cornered by gay activists. It's actually, the video's online. They went to his home, and he renounced it and apologized. It's a very strange episode in sociological research. Brokeback Mountain wins multiple Academy Awards in 2005. Proposition 8, we all know about that. It passed in 2008 and then was repealed. Don't Ask, Don't Tell is repealed. In 2010 to present, the Supreme Court ruled gay marriage is legal throughout the US. RuPaul's Drag Race won 14 Primetime Emmy Awards. Laverne Cox, Caitlyn Jenner, and Elliot Page came out as transgender. And the Respect for Marriage Act was passed in 2022, and the church was involved in that. I actually got some calls from friends of mine that were very upset that the church supported that. I think the church realized the war was lost, and they wanted to secure some religious rights. But interesting, fascinating history. This doesn't do it justice. And this is where we are today. The vast majority of America has a very positive view of the LGBT movement, at least in polite society. Okay, so what good came out of this movement? There's some good. Social awareness and support. I think it's good to know that sexual minorities exist. I think it's a really positive thing. Tolerance and acceptance is part of that awareness. Legal reforms. I think it's not okay to discriminate based on how someone feels about something. The church got behind this years ago, discrimination, legal discrimination over being a sexual minority. Healthcare improvements. Healthcare was, I think, relatively barbaric 50 years ago for sexual minorities. It's complicated now, but at least there's healthcare. Accommodations of new family structures. I think this is a good thing. Our families are different now, very different now in the 21st century. Suicide care and prevention. I think this is super important. Recognizing the dangers of suicide for sexual minorities and proactively caring. These are all super positive things. There are some negatives, though. Gender and sexual confusion and anxiety. It's real, and it's very challenging. It's hard to do the things on the left without having a cost associated with it. Influence of social dynamics in LGBTQ identification. It's very difficult. Once you become aware of something, you start thinking, well, is that me? Am I that? And that can lead to anxiety and confusion. And that's, I don't know how to do the one without the other, but that's a negative. Inappropriate educational content. This is very difficult. At what age do you start teaching children about sexual minorities? I don't know the answer, but a lot of people argue about this. And this argument, this contention, and some legislation that's happened, I think most reasonable people can say, you know what, that might be too far. That's a negative. Legal reforms. Some legal reforms I think have been unhelpful, right? Healthcare risks. There's healthcare, but then there's also maybe some things that we shouldn't be doing in the name of healthcare. It's very controversial with minors as well, especially around the transgender issue. A deconstruction of traditional family structures. This is challenging. On the one hand, I think welcoming lots of different types of families is beautiful. On the other hand, normalizing structures that aren't ideal, there's a cost associated with that. I think the whole nature where you got mom, dad, and kids, that's worked pretty well, and I think that's a good thing. It might not be realistic in the 21st century, and we need to be okay with that. And the Werther effect. So if you're familiar with the Werther effect, it's when someone famous or popular kills themselves, suicides always go up. People that are sexual minorities, a lot of them are told, you might kill yourself. If you don't, we don't keep you safe and protected, you might kill yourself. And when you tell that to a group over and over again, guess what? People kill themselves because they think that's an expectation. This is a very, very hard problem. How do you protect and educate about suicide, but not create a Werther effect? Very difficult problem. All of these are hard problems and hard trade-offs. But I thought it was important to recognize that there's good and there's not so good related to this movement. And of course, this is kind of our new reality here. About 20% of Gen Z identifies as LGBTQ. Now, this is from a couple of years ago. Most of the Gen X and the Boomers and the silent generation, it's always been around 2 or 3%, as far back as we've measured. And in fact, the most recent is now it's 30% of Gen Z. So 1 in 3 of Gen Z, these are younger 20-year-olds, are identifying as LGBTQ. That's strange. That is not something that we've seen ever. How does the church fit in? Well, the church is a heteronormative theology, right? Who are we kidding? That's exactly what it is. And what does heteronormative mean? It just means, hey, 2 genders, mom, dad, kids, heteronormative sex, everything else just doesn't really fit in well. That's how the church fits in. And so there's some square peg and round hole situation going on here. It's hard. This is why we're here. This is why we're talking about this. Okay, so I'm just going to share the options because I just want to cut to the chase, okay? You can believe queerness is intrinsic, innate, and immutable, the essence of identity and being, part of the eternal spirit. So that is one option. Option 2 is you believe queerness is a thorn in the flesh, temporary mortal condition, and not part of the eternal spirit. We'll talk about this a lot in the remaining time I have, but these are the core options, okay? How do we make sense of gender and sexuality? Let's talk about epistemology. If we think back to the first lecture, objective reality and us, and what's between us? A filter, right? And that filter is made up of sensory and cognitive and emotional, chemical, genetic, and we have a spirit as well. And that reality has to go through all that filter. And there's a lot of screwed up stuff in our filters. None of our filters are clear. I hope that's not news to any of you. Now, here's the thing, though. If we're asking, am I gay, am I transgender, am I asexual? That goes through our filter, right? Well, our filter is imperfect, right? And this is pretty high stakes. If your filter's not quite right, what happens if you make a bad call on this? So we separate our filter a little bit, right? Part of our filter is premortal. It's our spirit. We had that eternity going backwards. Mortality, that part of our filter, that just showed up when we were born. Okay? Question, is my spirit gay? Is it transgender? Is it asexual? Is it a sexual minority spirit? Or is my mortality, my filter, my body, my being, transgender or asexual? So I'm going to talk about option 1 for a minute, okay? And option 1, basically you have a couple sub-options here. The Latter-day Saint concept of God is cruel and unfair, and I cannot subscribe to this idea. So if you believe your spirit is a sexual minority and it's not compatible with the church, then you're like, well, I'm not compatible with the Mormon God. So I'm going to live in cognitive dissonance. I'm going to keep going to church and believing, I guess, but somewhere in my head I'm like, this God's unfair, this church is unfair, because if you have an eternally gay spirit, how does any of this make sense? And so this is kind of a miserable place to be. But a lot of people do it. They're like, I still believe in this church, but I just have this conflict that I can't make sense of. Option B, leave the church. These are rational decisions. Option B here, right? God is merciful and just loves us. There must be an eternal plan to accommodate the eternal nature of this way of being. So maybe like black saints in the priesthood and temple restrictions, God will change the current policies about LGBTQ members. Perfectly rational option here. Or maybe the current policies may not change, but because queerness is inherent eternally in the eternities, it'll get worked out. Okay, so if you are option 1, these are kind of your options here. Richard Osler is an example of someone who supports option 1. Good, Christian, loving man. He's an option 1 guy. He said, maybe Bruce R. McConkie in 78, when he talked about black saints in the priesthood, he said, forget everything that I've said. Maybe that'll happen for sexual minorities in the church. Okay? Taylor Petrie, he wrote Tabernacles of Clay and wrote an essay called Toward a Post-Heterosexual Mormon Theology. He's the editor of Dialogue. He's a historian, but I think it's fair. He's a queer theorist. I'm not going to read this whole quote, but basically he challenges the paradigm of an eternal or of a mortal queerness and really says, maybe this is an eternal situation. Post-structuralist queer approaches is kind of what he uses. Postmodernism, a lot of utility in that on this subject. Blair Osler wrote a book called Queer Mormon Theology. It's very popular. She says, the most beautiful and queerest of creations is godhood, a future of our own making through a queer Christ. The world is changing. Humanity is evolving. The question is, how do we want to evolve? God isn't going to stop us. What kind of God do you want to be? Option 1. Okay? Now, option 2. You believe it's a thorn in the flesh, a temporary condition. That's this, where you're like, you know what? I think my spirit's okay. I think mortality is a little screwed up. Right? So what do you do with that? Well, we must endure our trial by fire for a season and trust in our Savior, Jesus Christ. It's a little more simple. Okay? Now, a lot of science on this topic we're going to cover today. The science, you know how last time, maybe the last couple times I said, here's some options. The church, we don't know. Pick the option you like. I'm going to be prescriptive. I have to be prescriptive because the data supports one option. It supports option 2. Okay? If you are an option 1 person, that's okay. That's a tough row to hoe. Option 2 is supported by the science and by the theology, and we'll walk through this a little bit. Okay? I don't want you to be upset if you're an option 1 person. I want you to have an open mind. All right? And I'm just sharing what I believe based on the data I have. And I'd hope you'd expect me to do that and not just throw sugar at you. Okay? So, what does the science say? Sexual orientation is not necessarily static for many people. Gender and sexual identity is subject to influence and change for many people. And sexual attraction is subject to environmental and early development factors for many people. That's what the science says, and we'll look at some scientific research based on this. Now, they don't believe in God, they don't believe in spirit, but they study physiology and psychology and biology. And they say, you know, this is not as simple as you might think. And of course, the church is all on board with option 2. Think about 6,000 years of history. Now, this is a thought exercise. This is not science. This is just me kind of thinking. This is how I think about it. I think, look at all these civilizations, millions and millions of cultures and languages and peoples and geography over 6,000 years of recorded history. See that little red dot there? That's us. That's our civilization. Now, in my mind, I think which is more likely? Our current generation, the little red guy, is the first out of thousands of diverse cultures, geographies, and peoples to be open and enlightened enough to allow the natural occurrence of 30% of humans to finally express their true sexuality and gender. Okay, maybe we finally figured it out and everyone else got it wrong. Or maybe something weird is happening. Now, by the way, I'm not suggesting, because we've had people that were sexual minorities for all 6,000 years. I'm not saying they didn't exist. It just wasn't a third of the population. Maybe that means something strange is going on. Okay? So, we live in a time of peak pornography. I'm not saying pornography is the reason. I'm just sharing that we're in a unique situation, right? We're living in a time of peak cognitive distortions. I covered this a couple lectures ago. We're living in a time of peak deaths of despair. That goes back to 1920. Wow, people are dying. Peak infertility. This is a French study. Sperm count's gone down by 1/3 in their research. What the heck is going on? Peak gender dysphoria. Back in '87, the DSM said, you know, I think there's a thing called gender dysphoria, and now the literature's full of it. Peak transgender patients. This is 2000. This is the Fenway Health Center in Boston. This is Australia, 2014. This is in Britain. Strange. Strange. Peak autism rate, right? This goes back to 1970. It correlates it with plastic composites, something called a glyphosate. Maybe it's a fertilizer or something that kills bugs. I don't know. I'm not saying that there's a relationship. You put any two lines together and make it look like they're correlated. But the reason I bring this up is because autism's going up. And in one study in Australia, they found transgender people are 4 times more likely to have ADHD and 7 times more likely to have autism than the general population. There is a scientific relationship, and they're not the only people who have done this, between being transgender and being autistic or being on that spectrum. We don't understand it. But this is, again, something strange happening that we don't understand that's never happened before. Okay? That's the weird stuff. We're at a peak time on that red little dot. What other peak? We're at peak wealth. We're at peak freedom, maybe, peak distraction. I mean, there's a lot of peaks in the 21st century. I think that's a function of mortality. I don't think God saved up all the strange spirits and sent them into the 21st century. I mean, maybe he did. Maybe I'm wrong. But I see a pattern here. I'm a pattern guy, you know? I don't know. I don't know. I think these are reasonable questions to ask, right? This is Hunter Madsen. He's a gay activist from Harvard, okay? He said sexual orientation for most humans seems to be the product of a complex interaction between innate predispositions and environmental factors during childhood and early adolescence. So his partner, the neuropsychologist, and him, this is in late 80s, and they're like, look, we know, at least in the context of being gay, it's complicated, okay? It is complicated. But let's talk about the science, okay? Sexual orientation is not necessarily static for people. This is a study that was done in 2016 from the University of Utah from Lisa Diamond. She's not a member of the church. In fact, she's a lesbian. Not that that should be important, but that matters to some people. She did an analysis of tens of thousands of people across many different surveys and found that the major conclusion that we can draw from these studies is that change in patterns of same-sex and other sex attraction is a relatively common experience among sexual minorities. 25 to 75% of sexual minorities change their sexual orientation at least once in their lifetime. I know that seems radically different than the common narrative. There's a lot of scientific data to support this. We're not cookie cutters. We're complicated beings, and people change over time. Cornell University did a similar study a few years earlier, not quite as extensive, but it was a 6-year cohort of 12,000 young adults, and found huge shifts in sexuality. Hey, where do you fit on the Kinsey scale? 6 years later, where are you now? You moved. Why? Well, that's a big question. They don't address that. But people change. So that kind of makes me think, well, wait, if it's a spirit, why are people changing? I don't know. I think that's a reasonable question. The American Psychoanalytic Association, this is in the 90s. They could do research like this in the 90s. They can't really do it anymore. But they went to 285 therapists representing 1,200 homosexual patients. 98% of the therapists said, gay people can't change, and we shouldn't try to make them change. They asked that in the survey. This is the association to their own people. They look, we're not about that. However, 23% of these patients became heterosexual somehow through therapy. We had nothing to do with it because we don't believe in this, but that's how the survey resulted. And again, there's lots more data like this. Again, counterintuitive to the narrative. And I'm not suggesting if you're gay, don't worry, you can change. I am not saying that. I'm saying the data indicates that sexual minorities, a significant number of them, change for any number of reasons that are generally poorly understood. But again, what I'm saying here is maybe this is not innate and permanent and fixed. The Advocate, even they in 2014 said the increasing body of social science research posits that a sizable number of people experience some degree of fluidity in their sexual and romantic attractions, being drawn to the same gender at one point in their life and opposite gender at another. Now, they're not scientists. They're gay advocates. But they're like, you know, in 2014, we can afford to say this. Don't take this the wrong way, but this is one of the most fascinating studies I'm aware of. This is the University of North Dakota. You know how we're plastic, our brains are a little plastic, we can be conditioned? They decided, what if we took a jar of pennies and tried to make guys sexually attracted to it? Well, they did. They hooked up plethysmographs to their penises and through behaviorist experiments, trained their brains to be sexually attracted to a jar of pennies. I know it sounds stupid, but man, humans are suckers. You can kind of get us to do anything, especially men. Okay. All right. Gender and sexuality is influenced. This is a prison study, right? Lots of prison studies. Basically, they found, hey, are you straight, prisoners? Did you have sex in prison? When you came out of prison, were you still straight or gay? They said, oh, we're gay. We had sex. Now we decided we're gay, we're gay. All that says is identity changes based on what you do. Not surprising, a straight guy has gay sex after some number of years in prison. I guess I'm gay. Is he really gay? I don't know. That's a, true Scotsman problem. But it changes how people think. Now, do words do the same thing? This is the University of Sydney. They took 460 heterosexuals. They said, hey, we're going to give you books on the fluidity of queerness. We're going to give you books on the innate nature of two genders and a heteronormative literature. We're going to give you those two options. Or we're going to teach you about trees. That's the control group. Then they took a survey. Not surprising, the people that looked at the queer literature said, I changed my mind, maybe I'm not straight. They can repeat this study over and over and over again. Humans are so easily influenced. We just are. And that's a good thing, I think. Sometimes it can cause us a lot of anxiety, though. In 2014, GLAAD and Facebook teamed up, and they created 58 new genders for Facebook that you could choose. We live in strange times. Sexual attraction is subject to environmental and early development factors. 7% of heterosexual men report being molested as children. 7%. That's a tragedy. But 46% of homosexual men report being molested by children. Now, this is a small study. There are other studies like this. Okay? You're not really allowed to do these studies anymore. These were done in the 80s and 90s when it was okay to study this stuff. Again, I am not saying gay people are gay because they were molested. I am not saying that. What I'm saying is there's a correlation between adolescent sexual experiences and adult identification. And it's significant for many people. Okay? Let's not ignore the science. I don't want to explain it. I don't know if I can, but there's a correlation here. Humans are complicated, all right? This doesn't apply to all people, but it applies to a lot of people, all right? Some studies indicate the children of LGBT parents are 4 times more likely to be LGBT. That's not a DNA thing. Think about that one. It's actually more complicated than that, isn't it? But influence. We're influenced. We're influenced. Okay. Why do we say LGBT people were born that way? Well, there was a campaign, right? A blueprint for transforming social values in straight America. Gays should be considered to have been born that way, even though they're complicated. Remember that quote before? If we want to get legislation done, say they're born that way. And they can't do anything about it. It's just like a racial thing, or the colors of your eyes, or the color of your hair. And we'll get legislation passed. And they did, and it worked. And that's a reasonable, logical thing to do. Lady Gaga kicked in at the peak. Remember that, baby? You were born that way? Big hit song. She wasn't very subtle. You read the lyrics, it's like, yeah, we get it, we get it, we get it. Many LGBTQ people are effectively born that way, though some aren't. Many aren't consciously aware of how they came to feel the way they do. There is no scientific consensus on the cause. There's no gay gene. We've sequenced it. There's nothing there. But there are epigenetic theories that are interesting. Fetal endocrinology, epigenetic markers, something going on in the womb maybe, right? And that's effectively born that way. Does that have anything to do with the spirit? I mean, I don't think so. The American Institute of Bisexuality said, look, the born this way approach to sexual identity is losing its popularity among queer folks. They know that this was sort of a charade. And it's okay. You know, they're like, yeah, okay, let's get back to the science. We're complicated. So, you can believe queerness is intrinsic, innate, immutable, the essence of identity and being part of this eternal spirit. That is an easy thing to believe. Now, theologically, it's Really complicated. I don't really know how to explain it theologically. The queer theorists that are Latter-day Saints, that are sincere and good people, they can try. The science doesn't go along with this. Or maybe queerness is a thorn in the flesh, a temporary mortal condition. What if you say, hey, I've got a grandson or a granddaughter or a spouse that's like, man, this is deep in my bones, I feel this way. Man, my mortal mantle that I have on makes me feel deep in the bones about everything. It's powerful. It is overwhelmingly powerful. I don't know the difference between my eternal spirit and me. I don't know the difference. I know intellectually there is. But man, I can't put my finger on it. I think if it was any other way, mortality wouldn't work as a test. Let's go through some questions. We might have to go a little over, by the way, right? President McConkie has some brilliant stuff to share. We'll take a few minutes. We'll go through some questions. Is it possible that a female spirit was placed into a male body? I don't know. Possibly. I don't know. It's a totally fair question. Genetically speaking, there's a tiny percentage of us that are maybe a little screwed up. And does the spirit maneuver through that? I don't know, man. Fair question. Are transgender children born that way? We can look at the science here. There's been lots of studies on this where they study children and then 20 years later they come back and say, how you doing? Well, and they found that 60 to 90% of the transgender children as adults are like, yeah, I'm not transgender anymore. Now, most of them said, I'm gay, but they're not transgender. Okay? Lots of studies. Now, some of you might be like, well, wait a second. I saw this headline. New study shows trans youth are extremely unlikely to detransition. This just came out last year. Or, no, 80% of trans youth do not transition. Or, the New York Times, few transgender children change their minds after 5 years, study finds. These are real headlines. We're going to do a little epistemological detective work together today. Okay? Remember the iceberg? Okay? That's these headlines. You read these headlines, you're like, well, guess what I learned? Okay? Let's go a little bit deeper. We'll look at books made of paper and academic research. All these articles cite the American Academy of Pediatrics paper. They say, according to this paper. So let's read the paper. What does the paper say? Well, and we're not going to do the experiments ourselves, so we can skip the bottom of, that would be fascinating, right? Who has time for that? Well, we don't. But we'll read the paper, and the paper says, hey, we recruited 317 kids. The average age was 8 years old. So they took a bunch of 8-year-olds. 5 years later, these are transgender 8-year-olds. 5 years later, they checked, and 94% of these 13-year-olds are like, yep, I'm still transgender. Well, okay, fine. I don't know there's a whole lot of difference between an 8-year-old and a 13-year-old, frankly. I mean, you know, I've taught primary before. And let me tell you, when they get into young men's, that first level, they're just basically like the primary kids. Now, so young transgender children tend to continue to identify as transgender older children. That's probably true. I can accept that. That seems reasonable, you know? These other studies, though, transgender children tend to desist identifying as transgender adults. These are not mutually exclusive. These are probably both true. But that's really different what those headlines were trying to say. I didn't write the science. I'm just telling you what the news says. Fascinating stuff to read. Very controversial. Man, you want to get in a fight with someone? Just cite either one of these on Facebook. Okay. Do LGBT people have a high rate of suicide? Probably. Now, why don't I say emphatically yes? Frankly, because the CDC doesn't track sexual orientation of suicide victims. They just don't. We don't have data. But they have tracked the suicide ideation of students in very broad survey work, very broad survey all across America, and it's significantly higher in sexual minorities. So yes, they probably commit suicide significantly more. Is their suicidality higher because they're discriminated against? Well, now this is a really interesting question. The answer is possibly to some degree. Why the hesitation? One, it's really hard to test. And two, there are other major factors. One is Sweden. You see that? Sweden, you're welcome. Two guys kissing. Visit Sweden. Sweden is one of the most openly accepting places for sexual minorities in the world. It has been for decades. It turns out if you're married and you're gay in Sweden, your suicide rate is still 3 times higher than everyone else. What's going on? Completely accepted, celebrated. What's going on? We don't know. Here's some ideas that social scientists have suggested. Well, lesbian, gays, and bisexuals, their drug use is twice as high as straight people. Now, you can say, well, it's because of this or that. I don't, this is the data. And drug use is highly correlated with suicide. Mental illness is 3 times higher. Why? That's a whole nother question, but it's highly correlated with suicide. Is the suicide rate high in Utah? Because we want to talk about Mormons, don't we? Yes, it is. We have an elevation problem. This is well understood. Well, I shouldn't say well understood. It's well known among social scientists. See on the left there, the dark part of that map is where suicides disproportionately happen. And on that map up there on the right, that's the elevation. They think there's something going on with the lack of oxygen, serotonin production. They don't truly understand it. Now, and they've controlled for age. Young people kill themselves more. They've controlled for gun availability. Well, those hicks out in the middle of nowhere, they got guns and they kill themselves. They controlled for all of that. Something else is going on here. So yeah, Utah has a higher suicide rate. But does the policies of the church increase LGBTQ suicide? Yeah, we really want to know. We're going to keep digging. Well, possibly. But the current data says probably not. This is really fascinating. Tens of thousands of Utah students, the Utah Department of Health said, hey, we want to find out what's going on with our students in Utah. Well, have you considered suicide? If you're a Latter-day Saint student, you have half the rate of suicide consideration. Have you attempted it? Less than half the rate. This is compared with people that have no religion. This is not some squirrely little study. It's the U.S. Department of Health, or Utah Department of Health. If you're a Latter-day Saint and you're a sexual minority, you are much better off. You are much safer in the church. Why? Gosh, I don't know. Do you have a couple more hours? But the data is that this is a good place for people. Notice the religions, other religions, Protestants and Catholics, it's a little better, but man, it's amazing if you're a Latter-day Saint. How about that? Now, you don't see this in the Salt Lake Tribune. I don't want to pick on them or anything. But this is really important data, really important data. Now, does this fix everything? Does it answer all the questions about suicide and the church? No, not at all. But it's important data to understand. What options do gay and queer Latter-day Saints have? Well, there's 4 options. Only 4. First one is stay single and celibate. Or stay single and non-celibate. Or engage in an LGBT relationship. Or engage in a mixed orientation relationship. That's where if I'm a gay guy and maybe I marry a straight woman. That's what that means, mixed orientation, marriages or relationships. Now, the church is like, yeah, we're okay with this. We're not okay with that, we're not okay with that, and we're okay with this. Okay? Them's the facts. Well, are these options terrible? This is interesting. A 4-option survey, a handful of PhDs and therapists in Utah said, you know what? We're going to find out about this. So they did a convenience survey. So take that with a grain of salt. But they found several thousand people that are sexual minorities. Half of them were Latter-day Saints. They said, what options are you choosing and how do you feel? Well, single and celibate, 42% were like, yeah, I'm happy. 46 are like, yeah, I don't like this. And then 12 are like, yeah, you know, it's okay. Single and not celibate, you know, there's happiness, there's some unhappiness. They're kind of strangely similar. That's weird, huh? Same-sex relationships, they're like, you know, I'm pretty dang happy. Mixed orientation, pretty happy, but there's some sadness. Now, we don't know a lot about why this is, but I'll tell you something that's interesting. Married people that have children always score lower on happiness. It's a fact. It's a sociological fact. And mixed orientation relationships more often have children. Is that the sole reason there's a difference? I don't know. But 81%, I mean, that's pretty good. That's a pretty good run, okay? So this is the data we have on this, right? There's some bad data out there about, oh, divorce rates are 70%. That's crap. I'd love to share more information about that, but there's a lot of, this whole lecture, there's so much bad information out there, it's rough. But anyway, okay. Just so you know, marriage should not be viewed as a therapeutic step to solve problems such as homosexual inclinations and practices. But back in 1987, Gordon B. Hinckley said that. So that's a caveat. I'm gay, I better go get married to a straight girl, that'll fix me. That is not what you should be thinking at all. Bad idea. But if you're gay and you meet a girl who's straight and she becomes your best friend and you love her, give it a shot. I love being married to my best friend. You know? Mixed orientation marriages, they have sex too. And a lot of them report that it's okay. All marriages are complicated. Okay, did BYU electrocute gay people in the 1970s? I know some of you were wondering about this. No, but sort of yes. Okay, Harvard started doing this, the University of Milwaukee, the University of Pittsburgh. It's called behaviorist aversion therapy. It was actually started in the 1940s in the Northwest. Man, they cured thousands of alcoholics using shock therapy. Aversion therapy has a long history of efficacy. Now, this is 50 to 20 milliamps. You guys ever used, like, you go to physical therapy and they make your muscle twitch and you sit there for 20 minutes and they say, okay, your leg's better now, or that's all it is. How do I know? I've done it. I bought aversion therapy machines and did it on myself. Now, it doesn't feel good, okay? It hurts. But it's not an electrocution, okay? Now, interestingly enough, Harvard did 20 milliamps because in their research paper they said, we wanted to hurt the patient. BYU used 5, and they allowed the patient to change it to whatever they wanted. Still not comfortable, okay, but it's not like Jack Nicholson, you know, the Cuckoo Nest movie. Moderate success reported. Harvard had a follow-up 2 years later. They're like, yeah, some of our subjects got married to women. We don't know anything more about that. After 1974, everything died. Everything stopped. No more. You're not allowed to do this research anymore. BYU squeaked in 1975. They're like, we just want to try one more thing. Because this 74 change took another year to get ratified, and then, you know, it was complicated. They said, hey, we want to do the Harvard experiment. We want to use lower voltage. We want to try it without pornography. Because the way it works, right, they show you pornography, and if it's the wrong kind, they go, eee, and you go, ah. And then if they keep doing that, it's like Pavlov's dog. And after a while, you're like, I don't really like that stuff anymore. Really simple on paper, okay? They said, can we put clothes on the women and clothes on the men and try this? That's really, honestly, all they wanted to try at BYU. Very BYU thing to do, isn't it? 14 people participated. Anyway, Why is that funny? They're volunteers. Anyway, so look, I mean, just to be serious, this was very traumatic for a lot of people, this whole concept of conversion therapy. In the research end, it was, I think, all above board. All the data shows it was above board. There were a lot of private practices that, frankly, were probably kind of messed up. They were not academics, up to academic standards. They weren't controlled. They weren't doing research. And there's a lot of quacks out there in private practice. A lot of them were affiliated with BYU. And probably some bad stuff happened, you know? So there's your answer about BYU. Did the church teach that masturbation caused homosexuality? Well, no, but Spencer W. Kimball sort of did. But he sort of didn't. Cut him some slack. He said, what is more, masturbation too often leads to grievous sin, even to sin that against nature, homosexuality. So he said, it leads to this, but what he was talking about is if it's done in private, oftentimes it evolved into mutual masturbation. Those are two guys that are masturbating each other, and then into total homosexuality. So that was the context that he made this statement. It's taken out of context, and people just are really mean, especially W. Kimball. But this is where this myth, if you've heard this myth, comes from. What is the current policy on LGBT people? Well, they can be baptized, and they can participate in the church. They may be baptized if they're transgender, and they currently are going through a medical transition. Transgender people that have already gone through a medical transition can be baptized with first presidency approval. Priesthood ordinances are based off assigned at birth sex. Okay, this is like, hey, can I be ordained? Same-sex marriage may incur disciplinary actions. May. Medical transition may incur disciplinary action. Non-transitioned, socially or medically, may receive a temple recommend. But as soon as you socially or medically transition, no temple recommend. Okay, all this is in the handbook. But this stuff gets updated pretty frequently. If I put up 5 years ago, it'd be a little different. Quick, resources, and then we're done. Sorry, it's just there's just so much. There's so much. If you're interested in resources, these are resources that I recommend. They're not perfectly aligned with the church, but they're pretty close. GenSpec is a secular organization. It's not a church one, but it's got good stuff. Okay? So these are folks I recommend, with that little asterisk of, hey, none of these are official church things, but this is good stuff. I would proceed with caution and maybe take a bag of salt, or maybe just skip these guys altogether. I'm not saying they're bad people. I'm just saying the content here conflicts often with the church theology, can cause some confusion, and it's a tough row, okay? Again, not bad people, sincere people, just not really lined up well and might cause a lot of heartache because of that for you. These folks you should just skip, okay? I strongly advise not subscribing to these folks. I'm not saying they're bad people either. I'd also advise you that a lot of these folks use church quotes from prophets and apostles and scripture, and they're very interested in having Latter-day Saints subscribe to their way of thinking. Most of these organizations are run by former members of the church, and just avoid them. That's my recommendation, my personal recommendation. Keep calm and follow the prophet. Now it's time for President McConkie. Sorry.
That's all right. Stand up, stretch.
I told you we might go a little late here. Should we say like quarter till?